Hello, this is going to be my last video on the topic of ethics. I have done a series of videos now on the topic of bad leadership and then ethical leadership. And in my last video, I went over some of the major theories of ethics that exist in the literature that included utilitarianism, Kantian deontological thinking, virtue ethics, amongst many others. So in this lecture, what I'm going to do is I'm going to discuss specifically three major leadership theories and how they connect with everything that I have discussed in the past, which means how they can reduce unethical behavior in organizations and in leaders, as well as how do these leadership theories connect with the different theories of ethics that I discussed in the last lecture. So that's the primary focus of this lecture. This is going to be a shorter lecture than the previous lectures because you are already familiar with the three theories that I'm going to discuss today. You have learned these theories in previous classes. So with that brief background, let's move on to these theories. Now these theories, leadership theories, we broadly call them normative leadership theories. The term normative leadership theories may be unfamiliar to some of you, but it shouldn't be. It is exactly the same as prescriptive leadership theories. At least you would remember in my class using the term descriptive theories versus prescriptive theories. The descriptive theories are those theories of leadership that describe things the way they are. Examples would be the trait theory. So you don't necessarily make prescriptions of the kind of traits that leaders should embody, right? Though we do make some prescriptions, but the core of the trait theory is that it describes the different traits that human beings have and how those different traits pertain to leadership effectiveness, right? The big five personality traits. So essentially at its core, the trait theory is a descriptive theory. Even the behavioral theory of leaders essentially engaging in two broad types of behaviors, which is task-oriented behaviors and relationship-oriented behaviors. That's also a descriptive theory, right? So those theories describe the kind of behaviors that leaders engage in. Even LMX theory, that's another great example of a descriptive theory because it explains how leaders do treat people differently, how we do see in groups and out groups, and how there is that existence of different groups even within the same department, even within the same organization, same team, right? So then it becomes a descriptive theory, though all these theories have a prescriptive component. Now, but the theories that we are going to discuss today, they are more prescriptive in nature. They explain how leaders ought to behave. And when we are using the term normative leadership theory, we are emphasizing more on the ethical aspect of it. So how leaders ought to behave for them to be considered ethical, for them to succeed in bringing about ethical and moral behavior in the organization and amongst their followers. So that's the basic premise. Now, the first theory that we will go through is the transformational leadership theory. This is a theory that is the most researched theory, and this theory has also been found to be the most effective. So that's the good news about this theory. So while we are talking about how leaders ought to behave in order for them to be considered ethical, the good news is that if leaders embody the transformational approach to leadership, they are not only going to be ethical and moral, they are more likely also going to be effective in their role of leadership. So with that brief overview, let's go into the details of transformational leadership theory. Of course, you would again remember that anytime I discuss transformational leadership theory, I contrast it with the transactional leadership approach. And the transactional leadership approach essentially focuses on motivating the followers using rewards and punishments, right? So the followers do certain things for the leader in exchange of the benefits and rewards that they get from the leader. Now, you can imagine this transactional nature of the relationship between the leader and the follower that exists in the transactional style of leadership would focus primarily on the lower level needs, right? It won't address much of the higher order needs like self-actualization, like self-transcendence, because those needs are extremely growth oriented. Not that you cannot absolutely address self-actualization needs in transactional leadership, but it is very difficult because most of the rewards tend to be of monetary nature or promotions, which in that case addresses maybe self-esteem needs or similar kind of variations, right? Getting a preferred transfer, which could probably even fulfill some belongingness needs and so on and so forth. But the more higher order needs like self-actualization, where a person is committed to personal growth, to personal fulfillment, to a sense of meaning, those things typically will be difficult to get fulfilled through any transactional means. So, and again, you would remember our discussion that we tend to see more ethical behavior when people are functioning at those higher order needs as opposed to the lower level needs, right? So transactional leadership style then is not going to promote the kind of ethics that we may want, or it is not equipped to promote the kind of ethics that we would like to see in organizations, because again you realize that they essentially maintain the status quo. The underlying system remains the same. You are not changing anything. And if the underlying system is ethical, great. But if the underlying system is immoral, then you are not changing anything. You are continuing to promote the system by using the existing rewards and punishments structure. So that's the transactional leadership approach. Now, when we contrast this with the transformational leadership approach, and again, I won't go into the details of transformational leadership, though I do have videos on it. If you have forgotten, you can check it out on the same channel. So you would remember that there are four major components of transformational leadership: idealized influence, inspirational motivation, intellectual stimulation, and individualized consideration. And again, hopefully you remember that out of these four, the one that I value the most is idealized influence, which is the way of leading that is done by you being the best possible role model for your followers. So you are not just talking about ethics in context of ethics, you are actually living it, right? This relates, you can imagine how well, with virtue ethics. So it is about being courageous. It's about having that integrity yourself. It's about being compassionate, having that wisdom, right? All those different virtues that we discussed in the virtue ethics theory. It's about embodying those character strengths in yourself. And when you do that, of course, you become a more ethical person, but then your followers are also motivated to follow you. They want to aspire to the kind of standards that you are living. They trust you more. They feel inspired to be led by you, right? So that's the power of idealized influence. And through this process, of course, you create a culture of ethical behavior within the organization, because everyone or majority of the followers feel motivated to emulate you, right? So that's idealized influence. And hopefully you are getting the connection with the different theories that I'm making, different theories of ethics. Primarily, I think it deals with the virtue ethics that I have discussed before. And you have also heard me talking about how virtue ethics is my most favorite model of ethics, followed probably by the deontological Kantian model. So anyway, next is the inspirational motivation. Inspirational motivation is, again, you would remember a lot about communication, how you communicate your ideas, your goals to the followers through vision, through stories, through different tools of communication. Again, I was hesitating because I was wondering how much of detail I should go into, but again, you know all these things. If you don't remember, just check my videos on this topic. So when we are talking about inspirational motivation, if you have these capabilities, then you can inspire confidence in your followers, right? You would be able to make your followers buy into the core ethical values that you espouse. Hopefully, you actually are an ethical person, and the core values and principles that you espouse are really ethical. But if that's the case, then you can, through your great communication ability, succeed in getting the buy-in from your followers. And that will give your followers a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning for their work. Now, intellectual stimulation, again, you would remember it is about promoting individualized thoughts, creativity. So again, without going into those details. Now, how does that connect with ethics? The main thing is that you are giving a voice to followers, right? So you are less likely to become the kind of autocratic person who is so power hungry that is not willing to listen to anyone. So you are giving a voice to your followers. You are letting them criticize you. That of course promotes creativity and innovation, but through these contrarian perspectives that come from followers, but it also promotes ethics. There is a lesser likelihood of groupthink happening in under such type of leadership behavior. So that's intellectual stimulation. So you will be less likely to become a bad leader, an unethical leader, when you are engaging in intellectual stimulation. And finally, of course, we have individualized consideration, which is a much more simple component of transformational leadership. It's very important, but it is very easy to understand because we are talking about genuinely caring for our followers. So this would be the altruism component that we had discussed in the last lecture, right? So on one extreme we had the ethical egoism, and on the other extreme we had altruism, where people have concern for others, sometimes even at the cost for oneself. So when we are talking about individualized consideration, really caring, genuinely caring for the followers, then we are going more into the altruism dimension. We are not even talking about utilitarianism here, where we are trying to maximize the benefits for maximum number of people. That would have been more generic relationship oriented behavior. But remember, this is individualized consideration. We are taking into account the needs of each and every individual person, and acting accordingly, which means we are not treating any individual as a means to some higher end, or some ulterior end, which is what utilitarianism is. So this is what we would call genuine altruism. So hopefully you are getting the connections between these different components of transformational leadership theory with the other theories that we have discussed so far. So again, you would remember from the lectures from my other classes, there is this aspect of pseudo-transformational leadership. So these are leaders who are not really transformational leaders, but they appear to be like transformational leaders. So of course that's problematic. These are what we would call the bad leaders, right? So we don't want pseudo-transformational leadership. What we want is genuine or authentic transformational leadership. And the way I see it, and this is something that I believe I have mentioned in my lecture on the transformational leadership theory as well. In pseudo-transformational leadership, you don't see as much of idealized influence. So people are not, these leaders aren't walking that talk. They do not have integrity. You do not see them engaging in individualized consideration either. So they do not genuinely care for different people in the organization. They do not engage in intellectual stimulation either, at least in the dimension of encouraging the voice, contrarian voice from their followers. What we do see in the pseudo-transformational leaders is high amounts of inspirational motivation. So they may be great communicators who inspire a lot of confidence in people, but they lack on these other three fronts of transformational leadership. So this should give you an idea again about how to identify pseudo-transformational leaders and where to place your emphasis on. So transformational leadership theory, as again I have mentioned in the beginning of this lecture as well as in my original lectures on transformational leadership theory, is the most researched theory. It has the maximum amount of evidence in its support of how effective it is as a way to lead people. That said, it still has weaknesses, right? So it is still highly leader-centric, and potentially it could lead to dependency in the followers. Dependency in the leader amongst the followers is what I meant to say. And one thing, this would apply to the other leadership theories that I will be discussing as well. But even transformational leadership approach gets abused, right? So yes, if we talk in probability terms, the likelihood of abuse of transformational leadership is much lower than the transactional model of leadership. But still, there is no guarantee that we will not see unethical behavior amongst leaders who are who are considered transformational leaders. But again, as I mentioned, the key is to identify how much of idealized influence, how much of genuine, idealized, individualized consideration and intellectual stimulation. These three factors we see in these leaders. If we see predominance of only inspirational motivation, then that's a big red flag. Another weakness of the transformational leadership theory, I would say, at least in the short run, is that because they tend to focus more on the higher order needs, these higher order needs tend to be a little less intense than the lower level needs, right? When you're hungry, you are hungry. You want it desperately. Of course, these are extreme examples, what I'm giving. But generally, there's a sense of urgency associated with the lower level needs, which isn't necessarily the case with self-actualization, with self-transcendence. So from that perspective, if you are relying only on transformational leadership and completely negating transactional leadership, that's not a wise approach either. And you would remember this message from my previous lectures on the same topic. So that's something that we need to keep in mind. Though on the flip side of it is that once the lower level needs are satisfied in transactional leadership, typically the motivation takes a dip, right? Once you have eaten, once your hunger is satiated, then you don't feel hungry for a long period of time, right? So your motivation levels dip, right? So again, I'm not going into too much of details, but you get the analogy. So the lower level needs, once they are fulfilled, you got the raise, you got the promotion, if that's what you were striving for, once it is achieved, it does not guarantee a sustenance of motivation. Whereas if you are promoting these higher order needs like self-actualization, then what happens is that the motivation is sustained over a much longer period of time. Not only sustained, it actually increases with those opportunities of self-actualization. So that's the positive side of transformational leadership. Now, the next theory that we will quickly go through is servant leadership. And again, this is a theory that you would have been exposed in many of your classes because it's a very popular leadership theory. Now, when it comes to evidence supporting the efficacy of servant leadership, it is not as high as transformational leadership theory, but it is still a fairly well-researched theory, and there being a fairly substantial amount of research supporting its efficacy as well. So it's great that this theory is also one of those theories that gives you insights about how you can be an ethical leader. So again, you would remember that this theory was proposed by Robert Greenleaf in the 70s, and again, I probably shouldn't go through all that detail, all these things. So a servant leadership, what happens in servant leadership? The focus shifts from the leader to the follower. You are there. Your primary reason of existence as a leader is to serve your follower, which is what? Altruism. So it correlates directly with the altruism model that I had discussed in my last lecture. So it should be pretty simple and straightforward. When it comes to there are many components of servant leadership. In some of the other classes, you may have seen 10 different components. Here in your current textbook, you see 5 components. Irrespective of what those components are, the point is that these different components do connect with different aspects of ethical theories that we have discussed before. So when you take stewardship, what happens? You are not functioning from a perspective of self-interest. So it is not ethical egoism. You are just being a steward who is carrying forward the organization, who is prioritizing the interests of the followers of the organization over one's self, right? So that's what ethical leadership is. And through this process, you prevent unethical behavior cropping in the organization. You prevent selfishness, nepotism, favoritism in the leader. Now again, but remember, this is an ought to kind of leadership model, strongly ought to, because whereas transformational leadership model did have some descriptive aspect to it, but the servant leadership is a highly idealized form of leadership. Again, does not mean that it does not work. It does work, but it can be. A leader has to be motivated to adopt this approach. When we are talking about obligation, we are talking about creating a culture of accountability, right, in the organization. So when you are taking your obligations and responsibilities seriously, through that process, you create a culture of accountability in the organization, which then obviously will prevent negligence and irresponsibility and lack of accountability in the amongst your followers and in the organization. So hopefully you are getting a connection between how these different components of servant leadership promote ethics in the leader and in the followers and the organization. When you are partnering with your followers, what is this? It is you not treating your followers as a means to some end. Some end would be profits or whatever. You are treating them as partners. So it is the very opposite of utilitarian thinking, right? You're treating them as partners. Now do realize, just calling your employees partners does not automatically make them partners. Genuinely treating them as partners is the most important thing. And I have to emphasize this because I was at a conference. This was maybe 5-6 years ago, where I was presenting a paper, and one of the sponsors of that research conference was Walmart. And Walmart, one of their senior executives was making a presentation at the conference, and they were taking pride in the fact that they called their employees associates. So I questioned them on that. Just calling them associates does not make them a real associate, right? You are still treating them as employees or somebody lower in the hierarchy, and that's well evident based on the way you pay them and so on and so forth. So anyway, the critical point is genuine partnership, not just calling your employee a partner. So the point of emotional healing, again, you can realize how it is strongly connected to genuinely caring for your employees, and that would be again the strong aspect of altruism. And you are also preventing some highly unethical behavior that happens in organizations, like bullying, like harassment, like discrimination, because you are prioritizing the well-being of your followers, right? And when we are talking about elevating purpose, this is similar to what we have discussed already in transformational leadership theory, but through these ideas of having a worthy mission, having a clear vision of things that you want to get achieved, and if that vision is in line with the ethical values that you espouse, then it sets up a culture that would prevent people from engaging in unethical behaviors. They are more likely to be engaged. They are less likely to be apathetic to the needs of the organization, right? So anyway, those were the 5 main components of servant leadership and how each of those components promote ethics in organizations. So ethical or servant leadership does have some evidence supporting it, but the critical aspect of it is people being really committed to this servant leadership model, and in some industries it is not as likely to work, because again, if you remember the detailed lectures that you may have received on servant leadership, servant leadership functions well in certain cultures, in certain organizations, not everywhere. So it can be a very unrealistic approach to attaining ethics in organizations, to make leaders ethical. Again, when I'm using the term unrealistic, I'm not saying that it cannot be accomplished. It certainly can be accomplished, but it needs that strong commitment from the leader, which may not be there amongst most leaders, right? So, well, that's where we will stop servant leadership. The next leadership theory that we are discussing is authentic leadership. And the very term authentic should help you understand that it is meant to be an antidote for the pseudo transformational leadership, where the leader appears to be like a transformational leader but is not, right? So what is really emphasized a lot in authentic leadership is showing your true self to your followers. It's of course means being really self-aware of your values, of your emotions, and of your mistakes, of your strengths, and all that stuff, and showing that real self, not putting up an image of yourself in front of others. And again, this is a theory that you have been exposed to in your other classes. So it becomes an antidote to the Machiavellian approach to leadership, which again you would remember from my discussion on bad leadership. So Machiavellian style was all about manipulating. It's about projecting an image that may or may not necessarily be true. Whereas in authentic leadership, it's all about transparency. It's about showing that real self to the followers and to the world. So when a leader takes this authentic leadership approach, they are less likely to be Machiavellian. They're less likely to be these bad leaders that we have in the entire dark triad, for that matter. Especially when we talk about the first component, self-awareness. The narcissistic individuals, they do not often have the kind of self-awareness. They are so self-obsessed that they lack self-awareness. So they do not understand their values. They do not understand why they are so obsessed with own self. So when you are engaging in authentic leadership, you are in a way countering the effects of narcissism in leaders. The next point that is being discussed here is balanced processing. So you are taking everyone's inputs into account. You are trying to be as objective as possible. You are processing all that information while taking the decision, right? So you can imagine then this is this more group-oriented approach of decision making, where you are, even giving weight to completely contrarian perspectives that would prevent groupthink from happening, that would more likely lead to decisions that are wise. So you can then relate how balanced processing will also lead to more ethical organizations, right? Internalized moral perspective. Again, I don't need to go over this again because this is essentially idealized influence. You are not just talking about this big moral values, you have literally internalized it, you live it. And transparency, that's a big component of authentic leadership. So you project your authentic self to others, including your weaknesses, and are not necessarily putting up a face. That is not true. So authentic leadership is there are, by the way, numerous strengths in the theory, in the model of authentic leadership, but it's the least favorite of mine amongst these three theories that we discussed, because you realize leadership is in a way playing a role. Right now, for example, I had to come to India to attend to certain family emergencies. Irrespective of what's going on, I am not supposed to be just projecting my vulnerability in front of you. Instead, I need to do my duty of a professor, of doing the lectures on time and doing it to the best possible quality, and also grading, providing feedback to you on time. That's what the duty of my role as a professor is, right? So it's not just about showing that all your vulnerabilities, all the difficulties, challenges. Sometimes it doesn't matter what's going on. You just do what you ought to do. This is what I'm saying is more like the deontological thinking that Kant talked about. You do your duty. That's what's the most important thing. And when you get so caught up about just projecting your authentic self, that can be problematic. So that's one of the weaknesses of this approach. The second big problem with the authentic leadership approach is that my authentic self may not be as well developed as I would like it to be. So sometimes you may have to fake it till you make it, right? You have heard this in many other areas, including some of my other lectures, especially related to stress management. So that's true as well, right? So anyway, all these theories have different strengths and weaknesses. Again, just because you heard certain weaknesses of the authentic leadership theory, do not discount it completely, because it does have a lot of wisdom, especially the component of self-awareness. If you are making the effort to be aware of your own motivations, of your own values, of your own needs, then you are much more likely to be of your own biases, your own stereotypes, discriminatory mental attitudes, your own mindsets that you have. Then you definitely are going to develop faster as a leader, because you will be able to fix many of these weaknesses. And if you are not even aware of your weaknesses, then you cannot mend them. Only when you become aware, you will be able to take steps to address those weaknesses and also bank on your strengths. So that's a really critical aspect of authentic leadership. Many of the bad leaders that we see do not have that kind of awareness. That's a phenomenon that you would have heard from me in many of my other classes, which is the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? And that's, if you remember, it's this phenomenon where you are so incompetent or so, for lack of a better word, dumb, that you are not even aware that you are dumb. That's the kind of problem that we see in many organizations. People are not even aware of their own shortcomings, their own weaknesses, and anyone pointing those weaknesses towards them, they take it too defensively. They instead of taking those things as an opportunity to realize their own strengths, weaknesses, and fix those weaknesses, they become defensive. So that's not something that either helps them or the organization. So because of these common problems that we see in people, in organizations, authentic leadership can be an extremely effective approach. But the important thing to keep in mind is authenticity does not automatically equate morality. That's the important thing to keep in mind. Sometimes you may be authentic, you may be I can be authentically evil. I am evil and I show that I am evil. So I'm being authentic that way, right? So these are some of the key things to keep in mind. So in that context, your textbook also talks about authentic followership. The same ideas apply, what we discussed in context of leadership here, to the idea of followership. So if self-awareness is going to be of great help to leaders, if transparency is going to be of great help to leaders, it's also going to be of great help to followers. So the basic same idea, so I won't belabor those points. So those were the three main theories, but we will quickly touch upon something else that your textbook discussed as well. We skipped some of the other theories like benevolent leadership, which is very similar to servant leadership, or at least the basic same idea is basically the same idea of emphasizing altruism. Benevolence means what? You are altruistic, you are doing things for others instead of yourself. So they are pretty much the same idea, so I skipped that theory. I skipped the aesthetic leadership theory as well, because it's not as well researched and has limited applicability. But ethical leadership is another theory. So we are not talking about ethical leadership in the generic sense. Rather, we are talking about ethical leadership as a specific leadership theory. And this was propounded by Brown and Trevino. And they found something that is different from what I typically have been talking about, and they discovered that character alone is not enough to earn an ethical reputation. So just because you are a good person, you have those virtues that we discussed, does not automatically mean that you will have an ethical reputation. So it is, in order for you to be effective, you also need to have that reputation of being an ethical leader, right? So what are some of the things that you may have to do? So of course there are certain things that are similar to what we have learned in the other theories, like being the great role model, which is idealized influence. Ethical leaders boost their attractiveness and credibility through treating employees fairly. So this is an important point, that does not get explicitly at least addressed in the other leadership theories that we discussed so far. So the importance of treating your employees, your followers fairly, and this is one of those theories of ethics that we discussed, the justice perspective, right? John Rawls' justice perspective. So that importance of fairness does get emphasized in ethical leadership. That's the reason I thought I should briefly include this model as well in this lecture. So moral leaders make sure ethics messages aren't drowned out by other messages they communicate frequently about ethics. So what's being mentioned here is that we can do engage in ethical behaviors ourselves as leaders. We can communicate the importance of ethics, but we also need to communicate it in a manner, those messages in a manner that it doesn't get drowned in all the whole host of other messages that we are communicating. So it's a lot about how you communicate, the inspirational motivation part, right? So it needs to gain salience anytime that you are communicating. If it gets lost in a whole bunch of other messages, let's say strategic message, financial message, and all that stuff, and ethics is just a small component there, then people will not pay attention to it. People will not pay the kind of attention that you want them to, right? So you need to position your ethical messages accordingly. Let's say if you are using social media, it needs to be either maybe in the beginning, like primacy effect, people remember what's presented to them in the beginning or at the end, but if it is presented in the middle, it gets lost, right? Those are some of the examples through which you could make sure that your message of ethics gets the prominence that it deserves. So some of these practical aspects get discussed in ethical leadership, and how moral leaders have to also use rewards and punishments to promote ethics in organizations, right? So rewards and punishments could be used to promote anything. You can promote bad behavior through the usage of rewards and punishments, but you can also promote good behavior through the usage of rewards and punishments, right? So all those practical aspects do get touched upon in ethical leadership. So like the other theories, this is also one of those theories that has certain strengths and certain weaknesses, but it is not as extensively studied. It is a relatively newer theory, and it is not as explicitly delineated in terms of having separate dimensions or separate components, and the scale that is used to measure ethical leadership also has certain validity issues, but that's more of a researcher issue. But I'm mentioning it because it also shows some of the flaws in the theory of ethical leadership. That said, it does still provide some major insights that the other theories do not. But in any case, I hope you got a good idea about how these different leadership theories connect with different theories of ethics that we discussed in the past, and how these different leadership theories mitigate, reduce, and prevent unethical behavior in organizations. So that's all that I have in this series. Hope you learned something new. Hope you found this lecture valuable.